Colonel Coutinho of the Brazilian army is undoubtedly one of the best military analysts in Brazil. He always delights us with brilliant presentations. And today he is bringing a fantastic analysis of the battles between Russians and Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, Velikaya Novosilka, and Toretsk. That's what you're going to see now. But before we start, I wanted to show you that the second edition of the book War in Ukraine by Dr. Rodolfo, Dr. Latterge, and Pedro Drummond is coming out. The purchase link is here in the description. Subscribers of Arte da Guerra get a 40% discount. So take a look here, because it's worth it. It's the most comprehensive work in Portuguese about the war in Ukraine. Now, let's get to the analysis of the commentary.
Bem-vindos! Este é o podcast do Coronel
Welcome.
Coutinho.
This is the podcast of Colonel Coutinho from the Brazilian Army Reserve. Colonel Coutinho is the editor of the Russian-Ukrainian War Channel and a contributor to the Art of War channel. I am Victoria, the artificial intelligence assistant of the channel. Our topic today is conducting a comparative analysis of the combat power of Russian and Ukrainian troops in three directions of the Donbas theater of operations. We will quantitatively compare the major Russian and Ukrainian units on the fronts of Pokrovsk, Velikaya Novosilka, and Toretsk. Music.
Velikaya Novosilka e Toretsk. Vamos inicialmente tratar da direção de Pokrovsk.
Let's initially address the direction of Pokrovsk, which contains the largest number of units on each side. To facilitate the analysis, we divided this direction into three distinct sectors: Pokrovsk, Krasnoarmeysk, and Vodian. Let's initially analyze the sector of the city of Pokrovsk. On the Russian side, we have a total of 4 mechanized infantry brigades and 1 infantry regiment in this sector. On the Ukrainian side, we have 4 mechanized infantry brigades and 1 airborne assault brigade. We can say that in this sector, the combat power is balanced at a ratio of 1-to-1, which would not guarantee that the Russians are maintaining the initiative in this sector.
Vamos agora para o setor de Krasnoarmeysk. Ali,
let's now move to the Krasnoarmeysk sector. There, the Russians have 2 brigades, 1 mechanized infantry, and the other an air-mobile assault brigade, as well as 2 infantry regiments. On the Ukrainian side, we observe only 3 mechanized infantry brigades. This results in a 4-to-3 combat power ratio, favorable to the Russians, but still not sufficient for an offensive initiative. Now let's go to the Vodian sector. There, the Russians have only 1 mechanized infantry brigade, while the Ukrainians have 2 mechanized infantry brigades and 2 regiments, including 1 armored regiment.
E 2 regimentos, inclusive de carros de combate. Mas ali também os russos conseguiram manter a iniciativa.
But there too, the Russians managed to maintain the initiative and captured the strategic junction of the T-0404 highway, which disrupted the entire logistical flow and Ukrainian reserves in that sector. Well, in the overall combat power of both sides, throughout the Pokrovsk direction, we see that the Russians are at a disadvantage in terms of large units, at a ratio of 6-to-8. However, contrary to quantitative logic, the Russians have managed to maintain the initiative throughout the sector. Now let's look at the situation in Velikaya Novosilka.
Vamos ver agora a situação em Velikaya Novosilka. Incrivelmente, notamos que os ucranianos.
Incredibly, we notice that the Ukrainians prioritized the defense of this sector of the front, having a quantitative superiority of brigades and regiments at a rate of 7 Russian to 11 Ukrainian. It is unthinkable to carry out an encirclement maneuver with such an unfavorable relative combat power ratio for the Russians. Other factors must be at play. Let's look at the direction of Toretsk. In this sector of the front, the Russian troops have 3 mechanized infantry brigades and 5 mechanized infantry regiments. As for the Ukrainians, they have 2 political movement brigades, Azov and Lut, as well as 4 mechanized infantry brigades.
Assim como 4 brigadas de infantaria mecanizada. Ou seja, nos combates em Toretsk,
In other words, in the battles in Toretsk, there is a favorable ratio for the Russians of 8 to 6, but it is still insufficient for an offensive action, which in recent days has been carried out quite successfully, with the capture of practically the entire urban area of the city, as we mentioned, after years of fighting. Well, considering that the Russians have a comparative disadvantage in combat power in Pokrovsk, 6 to 8, and in Velikaya Novosilka, 7 to 11, we conclude that the Russians, who have the offensive initiative throughout the Donbass, only have a small advantage in Toretsk of 8 to 6. Overall, concluding our reasoning, the Russians have a disadvantage in quantitative combat power of 21 to 28 compared to the large units present in the area.
Em relação às grandes unidades presentes na área. O fato é que as tropas ucranianas possuem poder
The fact is that Ukrainian troops have nominal or quantitative combat power equal to or greater on all fronts, except in Toretsk, which is a location with a strong characteristic of urban combat, an environment somewhat avoided by the Russians since the experience in Bakhmut. We can conclude that the first point is that there is a Ukrainian inability to maintain the initiative in these 3 directions, despite their superior nominal combat power. This can only be justified by a significant degradation of their brigades due to a lack of personnel and material. Questions of troop morale and leadership are also being raised by the Ukrainians themselves. The second point is that, without the decree to lower the mobilization age in Ukraine to 18, this situation will not improve, not even in the medium term. Well, that was our podcast for today. Don't forget to subscribe to the Arte de Guerra channel on YouTube and the Russo-Ukrainian War channel on Telegram. Support the channels dedicated to defense issues. Like, comment, and share on your social networks. A big hug, and see you in the next podcast with Colonel Coutinho.
E até o próximo podcast do Coronel Coutinho.
Bom, gente, na nossa lista de desejos que se encontra aqui na descrição do
Well,
vídeo,
folks,
vocês,
in our wish list, found in the video description, you'll find many books about the war in Ukraine. And I remind you of the following. Books delivered by Amazon's delivery system arrive quite quickly. But if you're from the generation that prefers a Kindle book, you can download it instantly. The prices are very good, the topics are quite up to date, and they will give you a very clear picture of what's happening in the war in Ukraine. And I remind you that every time you buy books and other items on Amazon, you are supporting the Arte de Guerra channel.
outros itens na Amazon, vocês estão ajudando o canal Arte da Guerra.
Katriana Zanato.